Hello, and thank you so much for joining us in what is our last webinar for 2021. Where did that year go? You are kindly joining us by Zoom. And if you've joined us by Zoom before, you'll know the routine that you'll be able to take part in our polls and submit your questions through the Q&A function. So thank you for joining us by Zoom. And thank you for joining us if this has been more than your first webinar that you've joined us for. Thank you so much for coming back again. It's great to have you. And I'm also delighted now to welcome everyone who's joining us from Facebook Live to the last webinar, World Horse Welfare webinar for 2021, brought to you in conjunction today with the University of Nottingham on how can we tell if our horses are happy. So to help us tackle this very interesting issue, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Nat Warren, renowned educationalist and applied scientist by background, journalist, novelist and writer Christa Lesté-Lasserre, and our very own Lizzie Bird from our Norfolk Rescue and Rehoming Centre. As I say, this is our last webinar of 2021, and next year we will be resuming our webinars, and I think we're going to be starting, not confirmed yet, and I haven't got a topic for you other than that everything's confirmed, is on the 26th of January. So please do look out for details about our next webinar, which I think will be starting again on Wednesday the 26th of January, or if you're in Nat's territory, on Thursday the morning of Thursday the 27th of January. So please, as before, this is very much a two-way conversation. So if you're joining us on Facebook Live, please do share the video. Please remember tonight's webinar and all the previous webinars all the way back to June 2020 are available on our YouTube channel. And if you enjoy tonight, which I very much, or today, I very much hope you will do, then please share that with your family and friends. And also going into 2022, if you've got topics that you would like us to cover, then please do let us know by emailing us on education@worldhorsewelfare.org. So now I'm going to share my screen, and you say that's where you've come to, how to know if your horse is happy. And we're going to kick off with a quick poll question. Which of the indicators listed do you find most useful when trying to assess whether a horse is happy when being ridden? So which of these indicators listed do you find most useful when assessing whether a horse is happy when it's ridden? Now, if you're joining us by Zoom, you can answer these directly. If you're joining us on Facebook, then you can always put them in the comments function. But do you look at ears, eyes, breathing, rhythm, absence of conflict behavior, the overall feel of the horse, or something else? Again, no right or wrong answers as ever, but it would just be really interesting to get your thoughts. So whilst you're doing that, I just want to talk about the format of tonight's webinar, which is going to be similar to what we've done recently. So Nat's going to talk to us for about 25 minutes. There, I'm going to bring in Christa and Lizzie, and we're going to have a structured Q&A for about 20-25 minutes, and then the floor is very much open to you. So if you're joining us by Facebook Live, if you can put your questions in the comments function, and if you're joining us by Zoom, then please put your questions in the Q&A function. By all means, if you're joining us by Zoom, use the chat function to chat amongst yourselves, but if you've got a question, it's so much easier if you can put it in the Q&A function, where you can also upvote a question. So if you've got a question and someone has already asked it, then you can put it in, you can upvote that question, and that will bring it up the list for me to ask. So that's the format. And the last thing before introducing that and finding out the poll answer, I just want to say, we've debated long and hard about whether we should use the term happy in the title, because there is a danger of when we say things like, is your horse happy, that we are anthropomorphic about our horses, which is something we always caution against. But the fact is, we all know with our dogs, with our horses, they can exhibit behavior, and we're pretty sure that they're exhibiting happiness. We also know that the FEI talks about the happy athlete. And so while scientists might use different terminology, we thought actually it's quite right to say, how can we tell if our horses are happy? So with that, and before I introduce Nat, Basil, I wonder if you've got the answer to our poll question in terms of, that's fascinating. So look at that. Ears, 71% of you, so nearly 3/4 of you say you would look at the ears as an assessment of whether a ridden horse is happy, and 60% would say the overall feel of the horse. So it was good. We were debating which ones, which parameters we should put up, and the fact that only 3% have put other means that hopefully we've got most of the others, and then a third on eyes, breathing, rhythm, and absence of conflict behaviour. So it'll be interesting. I'm sure Nat will pick up on that during her presentation. So now I'm delighted to introduce Nat, who many of you will know, who's a long-term friend of the charity. I first met Nat when she was doing her PhD in the University of Cambridge, and since then she seems to have got a specialist. She's sort of flip-flop between working in Edinburgh and working in New Zealand, which is difficult enough to take yourself to and from. But when you're taking your family and all your animals, which she's now done 4 times, that's quite a challenge. But that is now very much ensconced in New Zealand, where she's Executive Dean and Professor of One Welfare at the Eastern Institute of Technology, which I believe is changing its name next year. Now, finally, a quirky fact on Nat. I do believe we have the best 3 quirky facts for our panelists ever. So Nat was used to, when she was in Edinburgh, was driving an ice cream van around a housing estate in Perth in Scotland, a gorgeous part of the world. And Nat and her little van was its signature tune, The Happy Wanderer. And one day, when she was innocently doing her rounds, another ice cream van blocked her exit from a street until all her ice cream had melted. One of the original ice cream turf wars, and Nat was very much there. So Nat, with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Rolly. Yes, it was a pretty scary time, I must say, being blocked in with your ice cream melting all around you. But anyway, I survived it. I can't say that I've driven an ice cream van since. It's probably quite good for learning how to drive a horse truck, though. Just like having sloppy ice cream in the back. Right, I'm just going to make sure that I'm doing this. Can someone confirm that you can see my screen okay?
We can see your screen. You just need to put it into presenter mode and you're away.
Oh, should be in presenter mode.
You are now
in
okay? Presenter mode. Yeah, good to go.
Excellent, excellent. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and talk again. I must have done a good job the first time, or in fact, everybody else turned you down. But I'm really delighted to talk about this topic, which I've said is how can you know if your horse is happy? But also alternatively, can your horse be happy? I thought that was actually quite a good question, and it might well be something that that some of you might ponder on after this talk. So thinking about what I was going to talk about here, I really realized that really I guess my focus is very much on how do we move our horses towards enjoying a good life, and what are the big game changers when it comes to advancing equine quality of life. And I'm not just talking about the ones that we ride and have for performance, but also all equids, working and performance. What is it that will help us to really start to advance their quality of life? And I just thought perhaps to sum up, and I know most of you probably know this, but I think it's important to look back a little bit. When we first started to talk about quality of life, we talked about mainly the physical health of the animal. And we were very focused on, on measures that would tell us that the horse was enjoying good welfare because physically it was well. And then increasingly there was a focus on behavioral health. So, what horses need to do, and that became sort of an area really of great study, is what's the natural behavior of the horse and what can they and can't they do when they're intensively managed. But more recently, we've become more interested in the secret life of the horse. What goes on in its head? What does it want? What does it feel about things? And I think that this appreciation that animals are sentient and therefore capable of feelings, both negative and positive, is a huge game changer when it comes to us being able to advance animal welfare and indeed equine welfare. So I thought, just as Rolly has talked about, there's a little bit of science here. Because animals that, or people who experience positive affect frequently and negative affect infrequently, do report high levels of happiness. And you might notice that I didn't say emotion there, I said affect. And that's because there is a kind of recognition that the emotion that we talk about, that is happiness or pleasure, might not necessarily be the same for all animals, but affect seems to describe it more sort of scientifically. But I'm going to avoid using the scientific word and just stick with emotion now. But the important thing here is that the positive emotion or affect is thought to be regulated by the behavioral activation system, which promotes approach. And you'll see I'm going to come back to that later when we're talking about horses. Whilst the negative affect is thought to be regulated by the behavioral inhibition system, which promotes avoidance. So if you then start to put all of the science together, as Webb et al. Have done for us here, I think it's quite interesting to look at the emotion, mood, and then the overall happiness line that's described in this picture here. So over time, which is on the horizontal axis, the mood of the animal, which is the positive or negative valence line, which you can see, on the axis on the left, you can see that horses' emotions can vary from time to time, depending on what happens to them. They have a kind of mood state that might well be something that's related to their previous experience. So they're generally in a low mood state, or they're in a generally positive mood state. But overall, the kind of sum of those things, plus the, what they're being faced with, the challenges that they have, describes their, what we would call happiness or positive state, their emotional state. And you can see that under relatively constant conditions, a horse can remain in a positive state or positive emotional state, as seen by this happiness line, even though there might be some negative things that happen to them. Whereas if the horse is in a sort of low negative valence and has negative experiences, then generally speaking, you'll see that that line will change and the horse will be in a more negative emotional state. So that's the science over. Most of the studies that have been done obviously on humans. We like to talk about happiness scores. And when you ask people what happiness is, it's generally defined as being when people are in a kind of positive or pleasant emotional state, ranging from contentment to intense joy, which is what we're feeling at the moment with our little hats on. And when you ask humans what leads them to be happy, now this might not relate to you, but generally speaking, it's people will describe experiencing pleasurable activities, good social relationships, feeling engaged in life, and life having a meaning or a purpose. And the happy people in the world, apparently the Danes, who will have the happiest scores for most of the time. So when we then start to think about how we measure human happiness, you can be sure that we get them to tell us about how happy or not they are. We do that through surveys, self-report. We also do a fair bit of observation as well. And so there's quite a lot of studies and guidelines about subjective well-being. So let's look at horses and animals generally. There have been some studies and certainly some people who write about what is animal happiness. And it's kind of a growing area of research. What makes an animal happy? What does it look like? Do animals feel happy? All those sorts of questions. This is my donkey, by the way, Bonita. A rather chubby donkey, probably a welfare case. So when we then start to think about why this is important, it's important because it's generally accepted that animals that are experiencing positive emotional states, where we would call happiness, that at that point their needs are being met and their welfare is likely to be good. So the question that I think we posed at the beginning of this survey that you answered extremely well, and it was really interesting to look at those the range of different indicators that you use, is how, when you're training your horse, or you're asking your horse to perform, when you're actually up in the saddle or behind it in a carriage or handling it on the ground, how do you know that those emotional needs of the animal are being met and that their welfare is good? Because you're being able to recognize robust indicators that tell you what that animal might be feeling. How do you do that, and can we do that? And I think it's quite difficult, really, when you look at the range of different ways that we use and handle and manage and interact with horses. It is difficult to say that we know very much about this. I think, as you've probably realized as you answered that poll, you know, we all have our own opinions about it, but whether it's right or wrong, I think is something that we do need to be open to. You know, when you look at these horses here, you know, you look at their expression and what they're doing. I guess in some respects, you will be influenced a little bit by the environment that they're within and what the people look like around them. And I think that's the big thing that we've got to be careful of, is that we all love being with our horses. And therefore we assume, or we hope, that they enjoy being with us and they enjoy what we ask of them. And I think it's important that we realize that we don't really know that much about what the expression of a positive affective state looks like in a horse. The thing is that we know an awful lot about what the horses look like when they're in a sort of negative emotional state. And this is some words that people use when they're describing a horse that is in an anxious state or in a stress state. And you can see here, you know, things like hyper alert, being aggressive or spooky, showing behaviors like rearing, excessive loose droppings, and all those sorts of things. So people are quite comfortable in describing their horses' negative feelings. But when we start to look at performance, we realize that, in fact, most of the time we are not necessarily looking for the presence of positive or indicators of positive emotion, but we're tending to focus on the absence of negative behaviors, or behaviors that might tell us that the horse is in a negative emotional state. And of course, the FEI heavily quoted as, you know, in the rules, saying that we really are trying to ensure that our horses are happy, or happy athletes. When you actually look at the judging systems, you'll realize that the judges are tending to look for the absence of these sorts of behaviors, rather than the presence of something very clear that has been evidenced as being about that performance, or that horse, whilst it's performing, actually enjoying itself. And that's the important thing here, I think, is to recognize that a lot of the time we look through our own eyes at what is going on for an animal. And for each individual animal that we are associating with, that we have to start to look through their eyes. Each individual animal has its own internal environment, and I'm going to describe that in a minute. They have their own previous experience, and they bring that to bear when they are looking at something in their external environment, when they're experiencing something in their external environment. And all of that sums together to bring about the emotional state the animal's in. So it's feelings. And Catherine Bell and her colleagues have talked about this a little bit in their paper on improving the recognition of equine affective states. And I think the key thing for me that is in the summary they talk about, that I thought was fascinating, was that there has been some research that shows that the videos featuring natural horsemanship and bridleless riding have often been wrongly interpreted to be positive experiences for horses. And that's despite the recognition that there are behaviors that those horses are performing that would indicate distress or stress. And so it's very easy for us to, even when we're faced with what the horse is actually doing in front of us, to be heavily influenced by perhaps what we perceive to be the right thing for that animal. So here's a horse, and you can see that this horse is I'm suggesting that it's thinking about something. So it might be in its stable. Do horses actually in their stable have a mental representation in their head of something that they would like to be in or go to, because it brings about a behavior that they might want to do? Or is it more like this, that the horse is sitting in its stable, surrounded by, its stable, and it's reacting or looking to avoid or to interact with things that are within its own environment. And if it was looking out of its stable at green grass like this, what would it be actually thinking? Would it be thinking, look, you know, I'm hungry, I'm motivated to feed, I see the grass, and that grass for me brings about a feeling of being able to feed, and because I can't feed, I become frustrated, and I show some sort of escape behavior to try and get to that? Or does it, for this horse, bring about a feeling of, my goodness, look at that space, I'm frustrated because I can't move around in my stable, and in my head I've got this kind of feeling of what we would call a rebound effect, a need to move, and therefore I'm feeling frustrated because I can't move. You know, these sorts of things might be going on all of the time in the horse, depending on its internal environment, if it's hungry, if it's feeling, you know, confined, and will bring about behaviors, manifesting behaviors that horse will show in trying to deal with the feeling that it's experiencing. So going back to what the humans can do, well, of course you can ask a human, how do you feel? So can we ask horses, how do you feel? And I think that you can. I think that we do this most of the time. For example, in veterinary care, we will often see vets palpating areas to see whether or not it's sore, and the horse's behavioral response to that gives you an indication of where that sore bit might be. You'll see this horse quite a bit. This is a new member of our family. This is Big, and he's very, very big, as you can see. And he's an older horse. He's obviously had a lot of strange experiences in his life. He's been a show jumper, and he's quite frightened of everything. And so you can see in his whole behavioral expression here how he might be feeling about this teeny weeny little thing that he's meeting. And, you know, I think, you know, you can see this, I'm sure as horse owners, you see this all the time. And I think it's important to start taking these behaviors into account in trying to overall get a picture of how your horse is, you know, what kind of a mental state your horse is in. Going back to that human research, if animals have what they need and want, and they can avoid what they don't want, they're more likely to be in a positive affective state. So remember that the animal's feelings relate to this activation and inhibition system. They will pleasure seek, if you like, and they will avoid things that they don't like and that they bring about a feeling of fear or a negative feeling. And you can do this again in the way that you look at your horse's behavioral expression in what they like and what they don't like. So this, you'll see this horse is a young horse. So Mickey is showing in this picture that she is seeking. I mean, obviously she's seeking my camera at the moment, but she is, you know, more than comfortable to come across the paddock and come and hang out with me. And you know, and I think that tells me something about her relationship, if you like, with me. At the moment, she's in a fairly positive state about my presence. You can see these horses here are in quarantine, actually, as Rolly said, they've been back and forward a few times. So they're looking at each other in stables. They've never used to being that separated by a wall. And they are showing a kind of seeking behavior that tells you something about what they want. In this picture, I think it's quite interesting. This is Big, and Big is showing a classic sort of avoidance, turning away behavior. And he's doing that, I don't know whether you can see this rope. He's doing that in relation to this rope that I've hung over the door. Big has a real fear of ropes on the ground and rugs over the door and anything that might fall on the floor. And so, you know, again, he's showing a classic sort of avoidance behavior. And I think if I then brought the rope towards him, I would know that this would be something that would cause a very negative experience for him. This horse is showing a fairly clear avoidance behavior of my target stick. So even though we've done some target training, he has learned the association between the target, the click, the food. He's had enough. He doesn't want to play this game anymore. So horses are constantly making choices. They're constantly making decisions about what they want and what they don't want. And the problem is that most of the time we tend to ignore these things because what they might not want might not necessarily suit us. There's lots of different ways that you can actually do your own choice tests to see what your particular horse wants. And they don't need to be as fancy as this sort of little maze test down the bottom here, which has got a chamber in the middle, and this is for rats, obviously not horses, and where an animal can make a choice about which arm they'll go down for what resource at the end. But this is a simple test. What does the horse like to eat best? What do they like to eat from best? I mean, this one was actually looking at whether horses could tell the difference between different colored boxes. And this is a well-known piece of research. I think it's been well publicized, but it's actually a test of a horse being taught that there's a target that indicates whether or not they can have the horse's rug on or off. And horses were then given the chance to choose whether they wanted their rug on or their rug off, dependent on the weather. And then there was differences in horses' ages, and there were individual differences anyway. So, these ways you can give the horse some control over their environment. And there's lots of different behavioral tests that are used in behavioral science to determine what's important to animals, ranging from these simple choice tests to motivation tests, where horses and animals are asked to work for something, do a task over and over in order to get something or avoid something. Just pure observation of what horses seek and what they avoid. Their behavioral expression when they're associated with something that they really like. And then what happens when you take that resource away. And these are the pieces of work that have been done on chooks, measuring work to gain access to different resources. So this chicken here is pushing through a panel, and it's a weighted panel. And the chicken, when it pushes enough times or pushes enough force, will then get access to food in this case. And then here's a chook that has to press a panel in order to get through one of these doors, and each of these doors leads to something different. And so you can then start to look at the relative importance of things to that chicken. And this sort of work's been done a lot on different species, less so on horses, a little bit on horses and their social contact preferences. But you can start to then work out for each horse what sorts of things are most important to it. Now, looking at the behavioral indicators of positive emotion and how we can use those, I think that one of the things that we can do very easily is to look at what sort of seeking horses are doing, what's rewarding for those horses. And if they're seeking human contact or scratching, then you can say that that's probably a positive experience for them. If you're chasing them around the field or in the stable to try and touch them, then I think it's probably fairly clear that that's something that they're not particularly enjoying. And training is another thing. When horses, in this case the donkey, are being trained, you'll find that very often they'll enjoy the first bit of it, and then they might choose not to want to engage anymore. And I think at that point you have to know that they're making a clear choice. If you choose to carry on with it, you might make that a negative experience. There are lots of other ways that you can say that your horse is enjoying a good life or is in a positive state of mind. So here's a couple of my horses out in the olives, and they are having a bit of a charge about, and and they're expressing themselves freely and making choices about what they want to do. I use play as quite a good indicator of overall feelings in my horses. I'm very lucky in New Zealand that they can live out all of the time. I want you to look at Biggie Big here. When we got Big not too long ago, he was not in very good body condition, and he was in a fairly depressed state. When he was with the other horses, and especially the donkey, he didn't really do very much. He just spent a lot of his time mooching about and looking a bit anxious. But in the last couple of weeks, this is what I've started, that we've started to see. I'll just go back and see if I can get this to play. We've started to see more of this. And I think that for me, like any owner, being able to see this kind of behavioral expression in a horse, even though he's, you know, he's working and he's still not quite as strong as he needs to be for a big horse, you know, he's starting to obviously feel more positive, feel a lot better. So, you know, we can look at social relationships that the horse has, and we know that horses have preferred grooming partners. And if you start swapping them around in groups, as has happened sometimes in livery yards, you know, that can have a big effect on those horses because they don't have their preferred, you know, group mates, and they certainly don't have their preferred grooming partners. That can have quite a big effect on them. So you can put together, this is me putting together a little chart, if you like, you can start to put together a picture of your horse and what makes your horse happy in terms of all of the things that you would normally be giving to your horse as part of providing them with a good life, but actually looking at how they need to be provided to satisfy your horse's mental experience of living with you. And you can then start to use your eyes, trust your eyes, because you become much better, I think, at reading your horse's behavioral expression. And the work on this sort of qualitative behavioral analysis has been done by Françoise Wemmelsfelder, or championed by Wemmelsfelder. In fact, won a big award for her 40 years, I think, of work in this area. And it's been used a lot by a lot of other people. And there's a lot of papers if you want to read about QBA and how it's used. Just want to talk a little bit about a small part of that qualitative behavioral assessment, and that's in relation to facial expression, because you all talked about, some of you looked at ears and eyes and so on. So it's been used quite a bit in looking at the facial expression of horses in pain. And there's a grimace scale, and you can download that grimace scale on an app now. And it's used in research to try to understand what are the kind of different facial indicators of a horse when it's not in pain or when it's in pain. And that's, you know, fairly well researched. But there's less now about positive faces, if you like, positive facial expression in horses. And Rachel Stratton, a number of years ago, started some research. She's just submitted her thesis, where she looked much more at, if you gave horses their preferred resource or options, what were their facial expressions? And could you start to measure these? And she did find some happy face indicators, and they related to things like ear position, like this horse on the right here, this is Mickey, and neck position, blink rate, eye shape, eyebrow angle, nostril size and shape, the eye aperture, the oral investigation behavior, and some of the chin, the kind of chin wobbles she talked about. So there are some behaviors, or some, not behaviors, but indicators that we can start to look at more closely to see whether there's a particular one that can be relied upon to always give you an understanding of what's going on for that horse. Here's another piece of work by Lansed et al. And what they found, you see on the horse on the left here with its sort of more high neck carriage, horse on the right with the lower, sort of more droopy eye, droopy mouth, that these were horses that had been subjected to different types of grooming procedures. The one on the right with the ears pointing slightly backwards, the lip extended and the eyes half closed, were described as horses in a more positive emotional state. The ones on the left in a more negative emotional state. So, you know, kind of research in this area is starting to grow. Interesting about the blink rate, the spontaneous blink rate in horses reduces when the horse is stressed. I'm just going to play this video again. This is Big again. And I want you to see what he does. So he's not really, he's got quite a starey eye, not much blinking, turns away, lowers his head, and you can see the lick and the chew going on here, which I think is quite interesting, because it's almost as if by detaching from the scary rope at the front of the stable, he then lowers his arousal rate and his emotion, you know, he feels a bit better. And finally, I'm just going to talk a bit about cognitive bias testing, or what I call the henny penny effect. And this is really about where you're looking at whether animals anticipate a negative or a positive event. And the idea is that animals that have been in a long-term negative mood state will tend to be more pessimistic when there's a cue for a potential reward that they don't understand, or it appears ambiguous to them. And the animal's previous response, previous experiences in life, so when they've had some negative things in life happen to them, either early in life or constantly throughout their training, that they will then tend to respond to unfamiliar or ambiguous stimuli in a kind of glass half empty manner, rather than a optimistic glass half full manner. And the work that's been done has been done on a number of species. Here's one on dogs. And you can see here that these dogs that have been tested were either living long-term in shelters or were pet dogs. And on the left, these dogs, you can see, were trained that if they went to a bucket on the right or a feed bucket on the right, they would get no food. If they went to the bucket on the left, they would be given nice food. When they were tested, the bucket was put in the middle, and the dogs that were pet dogs were very quick to leave the start box, the person sitting here, and approach and investigate the bucket. The dogs that had been in the shelters were very slow indeed, this is the red bar, to approach and kind of very cautious and very pessimistic that there would be food in it. So there's numerous reasons why horses might end up being pessimists or optimists, depending on their early rearing environment, their handling, the management, their experiences of even one-off events. Pain can have an effect on their mood, the way that they live, you know, with others, the social environment, the training that they've had, and of course the performance requirements. So you can start to characterize your horse if you like. So I'm characterizing two horses that I've got here. I would say the one on the left is an optimist and the one on the right is a pessimist. Mickey, that's Mickey with the circle on, that's her with her siblings and or half siblings. She was always quite a, you know, a brave horse, quite exploratory, quite accepting of things. This is the first time ever that I've loaded her in a horse truck. First time standing on there on her own, first time with novel environment, anything novel she likes. She's just 3. This is the first time with someone sitting on her, just to have a little walk around the paddock. And this is the first time she's ever seen a flappy thing. Just want to see you what a natural optimist does when you show them things that are a bit flappy or a bit scary in life. And she's an Irish draft cross thoroughbred, and she does throw to a thoroughbred side at times when she's in her spontaneous moments. So she's not a dull horse, but she's an optimistic horse. And this is Big, you've heard about Big. And this is Big's basically normal expression about life. He's definitely a henny penny. The sky is going to fall down if anything changes in his life. So just finishing. So I think it's important that we start to really consider what characterize the different emotional states that we have with our horses, because this is really important for their handling, for their training, helps us to understand the decisions that they make and obviously keep ourselves safe around them, but also ensure that they've got a good quality of life. So characterizing horses that are in a positive mood state, in a high arousal state, you know, where they are maybe considered to be enjoying life is important, particularly when we want them to perform and we want to be on top of them having a good time. Obviously, making sure that they are not in a negative emotional state, that they're, you know, verging on unhappy is important to us, especially when we want to have a license, if you like, to be on top of them and to have them perform at a high level. We want them to be relaxed and calm when they're at the end of having done a performance with us or at the end of a training session. We certainly don't want them to be in a situation where they're trying to avoid us and, you know, they're anxious and tense about being in a performance situation or a training situation. So, you know, these sorts of things are the reason why we need to understand emotional state, but we need to make sure that we also understand the indicators of a positive emotional state. and keep our horses happy in what we want them to do. So a good life is all about us recognizing that we've got to shift the baseline to what those horses need from us. We need to change their world, not our world necessarily, for the better. And that requires us to understand what they need, what they want, what they seek, and what they find pleasurable. And by reducing the negative and increasing those positive emotional states, we will make sure that they live a good life rather than just one that's worth living. It's important not just for us that they feel well, they function well, and they live well, but it's important for them too. Our happiness is all related to them feeling well. And that's me. Thank you very much indeed.
Nat, thank you so much. I could have listened to you all day, but that was brilliant. Listen, one of the jobs you have to do if you're part of World Horse Welfare is name horses that come into us, because a lot of them don't have a name when they come into us. I'm not sure we'll get you to name them if your best is Big. And I assume that was small next to the little pony was small. But I did love Big running around the paddock, and you could just see the donkey looked up. And if you had a little thing, it would have been stupid horse as it ran past and it went back to, I love that. If you're watching this on catch up in June, then can I just apologize for our dress? Clearly, this is December. We're building up to Christmas. So there is a reason for it. And finally, I just wanted to say, a huge thank you. You'll appreciate that webinars, anything like this, any event requires the effort of people behind the scenes. And Basil, who helps on the technical side and is brilliant, is staying with us. But Janet is also staying with us, but she's not carrying on. She's handing the baton back for organising the webinars, which she's done through the whole of 2021 to Alana, who's come back from maternity leave. So it's wonderful to just to be able to salute Janet and say you've been brilliant, and we look forward to working with you next year with a different guise. But thank you for all your support of our webinars. So now I'm going to share my screen again before we move on to the panel discussion and ask you for another question. How well do you feel able to assess whether a horse is happy? Now, clearly, hopefully, we didn't ask this before the presentation from Nat, but how well do you know? Is it very well, quite well, not very well, or not at all? So whilst you're considering that, I'm just going to introduce you to our other two panelists. Firstly, Christa, and Christa took part actually last year in our World Horse Welfare Conference on the discussion panel, and indeed Nat has previously taken part in a World Horse Welfare discussion panel at our conference. She's a very, very well-known journalist and writes regularly for three publications: Cheval magazine in France, Horses and People in Australia, and the Horse publication in the US, but also for other publications as well. And she someone who, as a accomplished writer, who contributes to a better understanding of all equids by presenting the results of scientific research on horses to audiences all over the world. So really sort of making practical sort of relevance to the science that is published. And I love, on a quirky fact for Christa, she was born into a space family. Her parents met at NASA, marvelous, where her dad was a launch pad engineer for the Apollo missions. She gives all her animals names related to astronomy and space exploration. And I was thinking of Christa yesterday when it was reported on the BBC that if you're a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist, it doesn't necessarily mean you're cleverer than everyone else. So you could be a launchpad engineer if you really try, because you don't have to be that clever, apparently. But anyway, so Christa, it's wonderful to have you with us. And I'm also delighted to introduce Lizzie, who has not yet spoken on a discussion panel at a World Horse Welfare Conference, but watch this space. But Lizzie's been with the charity for a number of years. She's now Assistant Centre Manager of our Rescue and Rehoming Centre in Norfolk. in the UK, and therefore has a wealth of experience of rescue, rehabilitating, and ultimately rehoming so many horses. And Norfolk farm, like all of our other 3 farms, have had a record rehoming year. And so, of course, in her day-to-day work, Lizzie is making horses happier as a result. And what I love about this, when we talk about learning theory and touched on by Nat, is the fact that Lizzie is unsuccessfully, apparently, trying to clicker train her 2 rabbits, Ruffles and Snowfinch. Just when she thinks they're getting the hang of it, they hop off and ignore her. She reckons that horses are much easier. You heard it here first. So without further ado, that's wonderful to have our 3 panelists together. So now we're just going to have a bit of a structured Q&A. We're going to look at an overview of happiness, equine happiness at different stages of life, and then happiness in ridden horses. But then please, it's over to you. A number of questions have come in through Zoom. Please, if you're on Facebook, put them in the comments function. If you're on Zoom, use the Q&A, upvote those questions if you see something that you would like. So Christa, I'm going to come to you. I mentioned anthropomorphism at the beginning, partly just to show off that I can say the word, but do we risk being anthropomorphic when we talk about happiness in horses?
Well, Rolly, thanks. I always struggle over that word myself. I would say that we used to be concerned more about whether we're being anthropomorphic in describing horses being happy, but scientists more and more are becoming quite comfortable actually with this term. And Natalie just gave us the definition earlier. That we're talking about positive emotions. The definition of happiness in humans is positive emotions, and then of course it says that it can vary from joy to contentment to joy. Well, those are more complicated terms, but if we just relate on these positive emotions that indicate a positive welfare state, I think we can definitely use the word happy when it comes to horses. And I think anybody who really understands their horse quite well, or any animal for that matter, you can tell when they're pretty happy or not, But that said, I think we do have to be careful about respecting science and the fact that we can't necessarily automatically assume that we know what a happy horse looks like, but we can use the term happy. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I doubt either Lizzie or Nat would argue against that. Lizzie, I'm going to ask you, Nat touched on this in her presentation in terms of the movement from the 5 freedoms to the 5 domains, where we move from the freedom and from the negative to ensuring that horses have a positive. So can you explain why you think it's important that horses have positive experiences rather than just avoiding negative ones? And can you give examples of how we can do that?
I think positive experiences with horses just really help to build their confidence and make them into sort of a more confident horse. So when they're with others, they're displaying behaviours which are more natural. They need to often overcome negative experiences. So a horse that's never seen the vet or the farrier before, we often get unhandled horses come into the farm. And that first experience might be negative with a vet or farrier. But if we can turn that around into a positive experience, it just means they're more relaxed and they seem happier the next time they see them. And we can use lots of different techniques like positive reinforcement and clicker training to try and help with this.
Brilliant, thank you. Nat, in terms of whether people are able to look after horses. In Switzerland, there's legislation requiring people to undertake courses if they have a significant number of equids over 5. Apparently in France, there's some kind of assessment, whether someone's able to look after a horse. Do you think that is a good thing and will help people understand how to make their horses happy?
I think any form of intervention that is going to provide people with an understanding and knowledge is a good thing. And I think there's a piece of work that was done in a riding situation where there was people who would normally just go in and have a riding lesson for an hour and probably treat their horses more like an object because they were concentrating on their own riding. once they an intervention, which was I think about a 5-minute talk about this is your horse and this is, you know, what its ears tell you, and this is what it's, you know, it feels like when the horse gets tense. And then you know, the riders were then filmed afterwards riding their horse, and they were also surveyed. That intervention had a massive impact, not just on the riders who talked about how they felt like they were better equipped and that they were doing a better job, but also on the horses, because the videos showed that the horses showed less stress responses. So that's interesting in itself. So any form of education, whether it's a 5-minute chat by the riding instructor about the fact that this is a horse and this is how it learns and so on, or, you know, as you say, because you're now going to own all these horses, some information, whether it's online that that you have to do, I think it's an important thing. A little bit like, you know, you wouldn't own a car and go right driving in a car without having a driving test, would you? And you know, and I've always believed very strongly that people should have a license to own an animal.
Fine, brilliant, thank you.
Can I just add to that and just say that investment is also really important, because the Swiss people are actually investing about the equivalent of 1 month's salary into these training programs. And so they're really showing a lot of motivation, and they're doing it I spoke with the Swiss researchers about this. They're doing it with a lot of excitement. You know, they're not, in fact, people that are not necessarily required to do it because it's only under a certain, certain minimum number of horses. They're people who are not required to do it that do it anyway. So I think it's also just a nice culture going on that people want to invest to learn more about how to take care of their horses.
Brilliant, brilliant. So, Christa, sticking with you, we often see horses for sale, as the owner says, it's wasted being in the field, as it's a very good ridden animal. Do you think it's possible for a horse that isn't fulfilling its potential in our eyes to be wasted?
I think that's a really excellent question. And I don't think there's not much research, as far as I know. Natalie can tell me otherwise, but I don't think there's any research that shows that. But what we do see is that there's research showing that horses can actually enjoy work. There's been a study recently on carriage horses in Mexico, for example, that showed that they do enjoy working. And I would say, you talk to just almost any horse owner, you'll say, yeah, well, he's bored in the pasture. Well, horses do like being, and they're quite happy being around other horses in the pasture and just hanging out. But if they've been used to being worked regularly, do they feel a lack? Are they missing out on something? I think there's a lot of projection involved there, that people can say, well, this was a horse that had a lot of potential, he could be doing better. Yes, I believe that's true. Is the horse unhappy? I think we don't know yet. The only way we can know is by going and looking at the horse and looking for these indicators that we're learning about now, to see, is the horse happy or not. And if you take him out and give him a ride and see if that makes him happy, and you see the ears are perked up and he seems more interested in his work, and he's happy to be caught, to be able to be ridden or worked, then maybe there is a risk of wasting. But I think there's a lot more research to be done to know the answer to that question for sure.
Yeah, sure. Listen, time is marching on, so we'll go on to the second section, equine happiness at different life stages. Nat, does the way a foal was weaned affect it in later life, affect them in later life?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, there's a fair bit of research now that's been looking at weaning and different methods for weaning. And certainly we know that abrupt weaning and early introduction of hard food does predispose those horses to develop oral stereotypies later in life. So the way that the influence of that trauma, if you like, of separation from not just the milk but the mother, and the way that that's done is massively influential on that horse's life experience. However, I would say, I've always talked about money in the bank. So I think that if you can set horses up well from an early stage, even from that foal sort of stage, so that you've prepared them well, even if you do something that is obviously not a particularly nice thing when they lose mum and they lose the milk, if they have already established good positive relationships with other horses, or with people that are familiar to them, and they're in a stable environment, then they probably cope better with those sorts of things, and that then will of course set them up better for later in life. So yeah, early experience is massively influential on the way they deal with stressful situations later in life.
Brilliant. Thank you. Lizzie, obviously isolation and quarantine is something that you'll be very familiar with in terms of, the horses that we take into our centres. And can horses, do you think, in long-term isolation ever be truly happy?
Long-term isolation, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, we isolate for a short period of time for a welfare need. We often find that when horses come in and have to be isolated, they are depressed and quiet, but they have health issues as well. So we treat the health issues, but we find that once they manage to get out and socialise with other horses, health-wise, they pick up quicker than when they were in isolation. So when they can show the natural behaviours and have other horses for company, they do sort of respond a lot better. I probably question why a horse would need to be in complete isolation long term in the first place.
I think, and so you put a practical, I mean, obviously stallions are often kept on their own, and horses that are, people have one horse, and so that in that sense that they're not so much being isolated, but they're on their own.
Yeah, I mean, on their own, but if they could see others, even that would be beneficial to them. So even in the distance, being able to see another horse would probably calm your horse and make it feel more relaxed, because you don't often see horses in the wild in complete isolation. It just doesn't seem natural to them. I mean, there are things like mirrors that we haven't used them here, but people have said they've used them successfully for making a horse think that they've got other horses around them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Christa, what indicators suggest that it's time for a horse to step down in its level of activity or to retire?
I think probably the most obvious sign is if he's difficult to catch. If you go up to this, whether he's in the pasture or the stable, if you go up to the stable and you try to catch him and he turns around, obviously in the stable it's easy, right? Because he's in the stall, but if he turns around to his back to you, then there's a problem. And if he's difficult to catch in the field, then even, like you do the trick with the bucket or whatever, and doesn't want to come, then that could indicate that there is either a short-term problem or a long-term problem. And I think if you address the short-term problems initially, is there a pain issue? Is there a training issue? And if those are resolved and the horse still just doesn't want to be caught, then maybe he's just sick of being worked. But I think that honestly, horses that can continue for a long period of time working with horses well into older age, as long as the pain is not an issue. I think they've developed, a good relationship with the humans, that maybe this isn't a problem. So I think whether they need to be retired or just slowed down probably is a matter more of their level of pain and the stress that they feel more than anything else.
Brilliant, thank you. So then let's just think about happiness in ridden horses. Nat, what principles of training, both on the ground and ridden, maximize the chances of horses being happy in their work, do you think?
I think that, well, I suppose from my perspective, I think making things clear to horses. So I think, making sure that you know how you are training that horse, you know how to apply learning theory correctly, that you go out to your training session with your horse having a very clear idea of how you're going to set up that particular training session, so that your horse is always nudged, if you like, towards providing you with the right answer, because you've set it up properly. So, you're never really riding in a forceful way. You're riding in a way that kind of almost the horse has no other answer, because you've set it up for them. And I think you do that by recognizing that when you're sitting on the horse, and people talked about breathing, I use breathing a lot as a signal for whether a horse has got it. They're kind of that relaxing you know, feeling of, I think it's a kind of relief sigh sometimes, because training can be quite stressful, just like learning stressful for us. So I think when you're sitting on your horse and you've gone out with a clear idea of what you're doing, you've thought about how you're going to reward, how you're going to take pressure off. If you happen to use food treats, that's fine too. But however you're doing it, that you're clear about how you're doing it, and that you're also clear about the sort of signals that you're going to be looking for from your horse, because you know your horse, for when that horse has got it. And you know, you don't just keep drilling round and round and round and round like shouting to a deaf person, you know, expecting them to somehow or other automatically get something. You know, that you recognize that if the horse is showing any form of stress or conflict, that it's actually because it doesn't get it, doesn't understand what you're saying. Yeah. So that to me is the main principle. It's just recognizing the horse, you know, is a living, breathing individual that doesn't always, it's not in your head, and that you have to set it up so that it's clear to the horse. Brilliant.
Thank you. Lizzie, do you think most horses like being ridden?
Very difficult, and I think they're all individuals, and they enjoy different things. Sometimes I'd question whether some horses are just well trained and honest and want to please. So is it that they're enjoying it? Don't actually know, or is it just that they're doing what they're trained to do? I'd say any horse in pain wearing ill-fitting tack, a rider that's too heavy, isn't going to enjoy being ridden. And there are different ways they may tell us, but some just might not, are just quite honest and don't tell us.
Excellent. And Christa, Lizzie talked about tack there. What changes would you like to see made to competition rules on tack and equipment that would improve a horse's quality, or sports horse's quality of life?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a lot of research going on right now about the pressures that are involved in different kinds of tack. I think more than anything, the horses need to have their saddles fit by a professional saddle fitter. But I do think that at least at the high level, that's happening already. But I think it might be interesting to include a little bit of science into it. I don't know if it's possible, but there's been some talk about maybe including pressure gauges or even tension meters in the reins to see how much tension is being applied to the reins, for example. Of course, obviously, we need to also, more than a very simple thing, is just to at least use the taper gauge, right, to be able to see if the noseband is too tight, because the horses need to be able to be free to express their behaviors if something is wrong, and be able to open their mouth. So I think adding a little bit of objective measurement in the tack could be really useful, and could even, who knows, maybe someday be involved in the scoring.
Brilliant.
Excellent. Can I pop in there, actually?
You can.
Just a quick pop in. I'm just quite interested, because obviously there's been quite a lot of debate about bits as well. Oh, right. And you know, so I just thought it might be worth saying it's quite an interesting thing, the whole rules of you know, if you look at some of the rules, they say you have to wear spurs, you have to have a double bridle, you have to have this, that, the next thing. And you know, I can understand that perhaps, you know, there was a certain element of, you know, refinement maybe, you know, in having a spur on, you basically just gently do a light aid in one particular place. But the reality is that's not necessarily the case, you know, that these tools that are required as part of the dress probably are not necessary. I mean, the whole point of riding a dressage horse is about trying to use the lightest possible pressure to get the best possible performance. And the art, if you like, is the expression. Someone described it as the glove, if you like. That's what it looks like. It should be beautiful and light. The science, the hand in the glove, is, you know, basically how you get that. And surely how you get that should be the kindest, most humane way that you can, because that shows that you really are a horse person, that you're showing good horsemanship. Yeah, so I don't think that you should have to have two bits in a horse's mouth to demonstrate that.
No, and actually the FEI have set up an equipment review group, haven't they? And so I think that work is started, which is obviously very positive news. Listen, I got so excited about talking about big and names of horses that I forgot to give you the poll results. So Basil, somewhat belatedly, can you tell me? Look at that! I mean, 100%. So no one says not very well or not a horse, not at all. But I'd be fascinated if we'd asked that before Nat's presentation. But thank you for taking part in that. That's brilliant and extremely positive. You've clearly all come to the right place. So now over to you and your questions. And Lizzie, I'm going to kick off with you. The question through Facebook: what would you do to increase happiness in a horse that must be box rested?
There are lots of sort of different things. So making sure that it has some sort of interaction with another horse if it's in a next door stable. Trying to use toys and things like that to make the feed last longer, to just give the horse more to do in the day. So a lot of horses that aren't used to box rest just will get bored, and it's just having that interaction. So if they can't go out, can you go in there and sort of even introduce some little games with them and things like target stick practice and stuff, just to sort of keep them active.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Thank you, Lizzie. Nat, a question from Kate on Facebook. Why is our consideration of equine experience and emotional welfare so far behind other species which cohabit, interact with humans, such as dogs? And as a rider, why are we still illegally and socially allowed to inflict pain? And she talks about positive reinforcement, positive punishment and negative reinforcement of various sorts.
There's quite a lot in that question. It's a good one.
It certainly is.
I'll start with the first bit. I would say actually that poll is that we just ran, where people will say, I know when my horse is happy, or I think I know when my horse is happy. Those sorts of things are the reasons, to be frank, why we don't have as much research in the area of equine behavioral expression, horse welfare. And why we know a lot more about farm animals. I mean, we actually do know a lot more about chickens than we do about horses when it comes to this sort of thing. And that's because there's perceived to be a welfare issue with chickens and pigs and so on, but there for a long time was never perceived to be an issue with horses or the way they were transported, or those sorts of things, because people keep them as pets or performance horses, or they're worth a lot of money, so there's a kind of feeling that they must be all right, they must be enjoying higher standards of living and care. So that's one of the reasons why the lens, if you like, hasn't turned to look that much at horses. And of course, increasingly now that we're seeing horses as being performance animals used in sport at the highest level, and a lot of media interest and more cameras, and people have access to this, and we've got a lot of people outside of the horsey disciplines who look in at racing and dressage and whatever else and say, well, what the hell's going on here? Why have you got two bits in a horse's mouth, and why is it okay to hit a horse to the end, through the finish line? And it's those questions that then have kind of meant that we've been able to start to really focus a little bit more on, well, shouldn't we know more about what's going on for a horse? So that's the first thing. And then the other one, which I think was about training and why why it's okay to use heavy pressure. And I mean, I would say it's not okay, really. That's the first thing. I think the main thing that has happened is that we've got a lot of traditional techniques for how we manage and train horses, and it's very difficult to shift people's thinking because those traditional thoughts and practices pervade the horsey disciplines, and going against the norm and saying, oh, well, there's no science to that, or actually that isn't, negative reinforcement is not a bad thing, but the bad thing is when you use it badly. So, negative reinforcement is about the release of pressure. So if you use very light pressure and you train to light pressure and you release it immediately, the training element of that is the release part. So you take your leg off, that's the horse's cue that that's the right answer, just as if you add something and you positively reinforce, which is, you know, food came, oh, that's the right answer. You can't always train horses with food. I mean, some people will no doubt tell me I'm wrong, but sitting on a horse trying to get them to do something fancy, you know, like going sideways and stuff, being able to use your legs and your reins and ride as well as you can, you know, we're not all perfect, but because you know about how the mechanics of how learning happens, then you give the horse the best chance to have an understanding of what is rewarding, so it can seek that reward. Remember, it's all about seeking it, not avoiding it.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
No, love it. Excellent. Lizzie, we've sort of touched on this already, but a question from Elizabeth. Can a horse be happy in the absence of companionship? And what can owners do to increase happiness in these cases?
Obviously, some horses won't be happy at all. Some horses are very individual, and there's always one that breaks the mold that possibly could be happy. Are there alternatives you could do, sort of like mutual grooming and stuff that a horse wouldn't get with another horse? Can you try and provide that yourself with the scratches and things like that? Trying to sort of just not be another horse, but sort of take that position of another horse.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. Christa, question from Sophia. How can we recognize when a horse is motivated and happy during a training session?
Wow, that one's a complicated one, I think, because I think, you know, the indicators that we have so far, we're learning to, you know, look at, for example, their facial expressions and their, you know, the ear positions and things like that. So I think one part is you have to look for an absence of any of the negative signs, right? Like that they're not showing any conflict behavior. So if you've got that, at least you might be at a neutral state. Then if you're looking for the horse to actually be happy during the session, I mean, I suppose if he's eager to move forward, he's eager to react to your responses, those are good signs. And if you happen to catch him in a mirror as you're going by, maybe you can look and see, you know, if you're familiar with the facial expressions, you can look at his eyes, you can look at his ears, but you can also feel his energy, you know, how well he's breathing and moving forward. But I think it's also important to note that, you know, I mean, human athletes are not smiling the whole time that they're running a race either. So it's not necessarily something that the horse is going to, you know, be showing a quote unquote smile during the entire workout. But if he's a willing partner, I think that's a great start.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think we saw Big in the field giving a little buck, and you would take that as a sign of happiness. Obviously, if you're riding a horse and it gives a bit of a buck, that's often viewed as a sign of pain and or stress. So it's interesting that. Nat, a question from Kathy: when horses are happy, do they show stereotypical behaviours?
Another interesting question. What we know about stereotypies in horses, I think, has grown quite a bit in the last few years, and we know a bit more about the kind of what's going on in the brain and the feedback systems that these horses get from performing stereotypical behaviour. And I would say that it's not necessarily the case that a horse that is showing stereotypical behavior is unhappy, is what I would say. I don't know whether they're entirely happy, but I think sometimes these stereotypies become quite ingrained and quite normalized for the horse. There's a sort of feedback system that's going on that keeps that behavior as part of the horse's repertoire. And so it might well have been unhappy or in a poor, you know, it might have had challenges when it started to perform the behavior. But if it's been a long-term behavior and you've given the horse absolutely everything, you know, so it's out in a paddock, it's with its friends, it's eating lots of fiber, it's able to move freely, it's got an enriched, you know, handling and so on and so forth, and it's still performing the stereotypy, which often they do, they'll crib bite and in the field and so on. I don't think that you could say the horse is unhappy. I think that you've given the horse everything that it needs. It's now got an established behavior, And in fact, in some cases, it's even been suggested that you should probably put a special kind of cribbing pole with rubber, thick rubber on the top of it, and let that horse crib if that's what it needs to do, and just try and reduce down the problems it might cause it for its teeth and so on.
Yeah.
Because that's some sort of behavior that it needs to do, a bit like people who bite their nails.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. Lizzie, Catherine Batch has asked a question, and I know it's a real challenge, isn't it, managing equine weight. And she's asked, if you have a very good doer that needs to be kept on a calorie-controlled diet, but also doesn't like work, how can you help that horse to be happy as you are withholding food and inflicting exercise on them? I love the idea of inflicting exercise on them. What thoughts for that?
For the exercise, I'd say it might depend on what exercise you're asking them to do. So it could be that they don't particularly like lunging in a school, but if you walk them out in hand in a brisk walk and sort of took them, like run with them yourself, and that sort of thing, that form of exercise can be sort of more beneficial to a horse if they're enjoying it. You can get their heart rate up that way, and just getting them out and about if they've kind of become a bit stale and don't like the exercise sort of in the school as you would typically lunge to help with weight loss. Reducing sort of their feed intake. Yeah, we have a few horses here that we might call hangry, because they obviously are looking forward to their next feed. So we will use trickle nets and just soak hay and everything like just to try and make it last longer for them, so they're not feeling as hungry for such long periods of time.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you. Some really practical stuff there. A question from Sophia on Facebook, Christa. Would it be possible to make it? No, sorry, I'm going to do that one for Nat. What would you say if you use would you say that if you use positive reinforcement, it makes the horse emotionally distressed or happy?
Sorry, was that for me or for Natalie?
That was it for you, Christa. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thanks. Okay. If you use positive reinforcement, does it make the horse happy? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. That's a fascinating question. I think the obvious assumption is that yes, of course, it makes horses happy, right? Because they're getting a carrot or whatever, and it's something that they really enjoy. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that positive reinforcement has to be trained really well, good at it, and horses can actually get very frustrated by trying to be trained by positive reinforcement. If they're not figuring out what they need to get that treat, then it could actually make them unhappy. And actually, there was a very interesting study done. Natalie was explaining earlier about cognitive bias, which she called I can't remember the term you used, the happy penny or something, henny penny.
Henny penny.
Yeah, but it's the optimism test, right? And so the Swiss did a study on this that showed that horses, they tend to, depending on the individual, they might be more or less optimistic or pessimistic on a particular day, but they found that the horses were actually a little bit more pessimistic on the day that they were studying, that they trained them on positive reinforcement, and they were more optimistic when they trained them on negative reinforcement. Now that was one single test, so it obviously you can't make a whole lot of conclusions on that, but it was an interesting trend that they found, and they it made them scratch their heads and say, why is this? And maybe it's because horses, they do a lot of negative reinforcement within in their own herds, in their own ethology, their own worlds, right? They kind of just barely move towards each other, and the other one says, ooh, I'm supposed to get out of your way, and that's negative reinforcement, right? So I think that it's something also that's quite natural to them. And so positive reinforcement, yes, it could make the horse happy if the person is good at training the positive reinforcement, but I think negative reinforcement could also make horses happy. And the word negative reinforcement is just unfortunate in the term.
Absolutely. Yes, I've often thought it was a real misnomer that. Time is getting on, and so we've got a fair few questions. So if we can do sort of a bit more of a quick fire round, see how we get on. Nat, question on Facebook: would it be possible to make a quality of life measurement that depends on the level of happiness a horse has in his or her everyday life?
Ooh. Well, I think if you do what I've told you to do, which is to just get to know your own horse, and do some of these simple tests and really be quite objective in the way that you look at it, look through their eyes, and then start to, you know, put that picture together for your individual horse. You could probably rate its happiness, if you like, and then you could compare that at different points, you know, in its performance, its life, yeah, I think you could do it. I mean, you know, it would be somewhat subjective, but I think it's a good start.
And one of the things we often suggest, especially around quality of life more generally, is to write it down, because otherwise, if you just think you remember it, you tend to realign what you think you've remembered. But actually, if you've written it down, then you've got something back to refer to. Lizzie, a question on Facebook from Lynn. Is a horse carrying its tail slightly to one side in discomfort?
Not necessarily. We've had horses like that who've had pelvis injuries in the past that have healed. We've had the vet barrier physio check them over their sound. They carry their tail to one side, but they seem happy and comfortable to us, often as companions rather than ridden again. But yeah, it doesn't always mean they're unhappy or in discomfort.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lizzie. Christa, a question for you on Facebook. Should the judging of subjective equestrian competitions, e.g. dressage, be changed to include indicators of happiness?
I think that's a fantastic idea. I think that if if they're looking for the happy athlete, which is part of their requirements of the FEI, then why not include some indicators of happiness? A little hard to find, I think, and as I mentioned earlier, horses in an athletic effort may not necessarily be showing the happiness while they're doing the performance. But I think it's important to be looking for them as much as possible, especially because if the human athletes, are working hard, then they know that at the end they get the reward, but the horses may not necessarily think, oh, wow, I won. So it is important to make sure that during the event, they're as happy as possible, even if they're doing an effort. I think it will require quite a bit of work with scientists to get that settled.
Yeah. Nat, question from Julia. Her horse has had over a year of lameness issues. She takes one step forward and another backwards, and she says he looks depressed, stands stock still in the stable after being ridden, having tack taken off. He will give me kettles but does not move. How can I improve his move? He goes out most days. He has a big stable out, and he has two horses close by. How can I lighten his depression?
Yeah. I'm sorry that your horse feels like that. It must be really wearing as well, because nobody wants to feel that they're not able to give the horse what they want. I mean, to be honest, I suppose I would, if that was my horse, I'd just want to check that there isn't any remaining pain, because if after a session of work the horse is kind of standing still and and you take the tack off and then and you feel that they look unhappy, then for me the unhappiness either comes from discomfort of some sort, or just that the training session wasn't a particularly rewarding one. However, it may well be that you're misinterpreting what you see. That maybe because you worry about your horse, and you've obviously been through a trauma with the horse and it's been on off and so on, that you're looking at things through your eyes, and perhaps you need to recognize that for the horse maybe standing still and processing and eyes slightly shut and so on, is it just coming down after a training session? So I mean, I don't know, because I don't know your situation, but I would check that the horse is healthy still and there's no pain, and then perhaps keep your training sessions shorter, perhaps use a different type of training methodology, maybe look at it being much more about riding out short sessions, going with others, making it into a fun experience, and then then see what happens.
Brilliant. Lizzie, question from Facebook from Emma. How do you deal with separation anxiety when a horse has to leave other horses in order to work?
So we often see that a lot here. It depends whether it's the horse that's leaving that's got the anxiety or the horse that's being left. So if it's the horse being left, we'll try and make sure it's got other horses around, things like that it feels safe in the environment that it's in, to make it less anxious. If it's the horse that's leaving, try and make sort of the training session that they are sort of listening to you, and so they've got more to think about than thinking about just their friend that they've left. So often, if you can sort of try and get the horse thinking of lots of different things, it might not forget its friend, but it might then sort of become more reactive to you, and be showing less behaviour about leaving its friend.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Christa, a question from Angela on Facebook. What do the panel recommend for positive reinforcement of a youngster? Angela says hers can be a bit nippy, so don't want to treat.
Well, I guess in that case, probably you would need to do some clicker training. I think clicker training could work quite well, where you train the horse to associate either a click or any sound that you want, good boy or whatever you want, a big click of snapping your fingers with the treat. And then the horse will also need to be taught quite quickly that you can't, that he will not be allowed to have the treat if he starts to nip. So any kind of nipping would result in the person turning the back to the horse and not getting the treat, so that the horse quickly associates that nipping behavior with not getting what they want. And then the clicker training or snapping or whatever can also avoid that being too quick of an issue.
Brilliant. I love it. Thank you. We'll probably have to make this the last question. Nat, I've saved it up for you. It's from Rosemary. What are your views on some of the natural horsemanship, such as getting a horse to lie down and then stand on it, or climbing into small podiums and stepping over rolling barrels, as done by some well-known people?
I don't really like to comment too much on different people's kind of use or training of horses. So I suppose, generally speaking, you know, I mean, I think lying down and, you know, teaching your horse to lie down using good learning theory and, you know, and obviously rewarding the horse for that behavior, if that's what you want your horse to do, then, you know, I think that's, you know, you can do that well. Standing all over it, I don't know what the point of that is myself. I don't think that's particularly respectful to the animal. I don't think it's necessary. But you know, again, I'd be looking for indicators of that horse showing me that it's, you know, it's not enjoying it, and obviously respecting that. But the other things, you know, the going over platforms and so on, I've seen done quite well. You know, obviously you're always looking to make sure that the horse doesn't injure itself and doesn't injure the rider or the handler. But sometimes, you know, teaching, like we used to do handy pony in the old days, you know, teaching, you know, animals that things are not to be frightened of. I mean, you saw me flapping a canvas thing, you know, and I'm not a natural anything, but I generally, you know, think that there are some things that are quite good tools done well that can teach your horse, you know, that there's positive aspects to scary things, and setting your horse up so that it's not frightened of things that it might come across in its daily life is going to make it happier, because it's not going to get so stressed about everything, and it's going to make it safer. So I'm not saying, you know, I think there's some brilliant aspects to all the training that you see, mostly. I'm not saying all training. I think it's about what the horse is perceiving, and looking at it through the horse's eyes.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you so much. And we've got through 14 out of 20 questions, which a score I never got at school. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to get through all of them, but brilliant to have so many, as Christa says, lots of brilliant questions there. So great to have you. So now I'm going to ask the panel just for their final thoughts. As ever, as we've discussed a lot tonight, it's been brilliant to have some really practical sort of tips from the panelists, and so I'm just going to go around each one for what their sort of concluding thoughts, take-home thoughts, final thoughts are. Lizzie, I'll come to you first.
I think if we can meet our horses' needs, observe them, listen to them, and react to what they tell us, and change our approach if we need to, then hopefully we would be able to say that our horses are happy.
I love it. OLR, observe, listen, and react. Great stuff. Love it. Thank you, Lizzie. Christa.
Yeah, I think the owners really need to, or riders really need to be prepared to be humble, and that's not always easy to do, but you need to be able to say that, you know, you don't necessarily know that your horse is happy, and maybe if you can look to understanding the true signs of whether a horse is happy, then you can really make sure that your horse is happy rather than just projecting or assuming that certain behaviors or expressions show happiness. You know, you often see these images of horses like laughing or whatever, but maybe they're just yawning, which is not necessarily a good sign. So it's important to be prepared to open your mind, I think, to what science is showing us more and more about what true happiness in a horse is.
Brilliant. So listen, before I ask Nat, there's obviously lots of additional material and references we can point you towards, and Nat and Christa have provided some of those for us. So we're going to put those in the chat function now, and obviously that we'll make sure that they go out afterwards too, so you can refer to those in your own time. Nat, what are your final thoughts?
Well, I would say let's make 2022 the year of the happy horse. So, you know, I think that's my main message. And you know, I think if owners, riders, handlers, people who love horses are prepared to be leaders rather than just follow the old way, you know, actually lead by thinking about the needs, the preferences, the choices, the happiness of the horse and what makes their individual horses happy, and then champion that to all their friends, to all of the people that they talk to, and really, you know, be prepared to be a leader for your horse.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you, Nat. I mean, can we talk about happy horses? Is it right to? Absolutely, yes. Hopefully you can join in that sort of your New Year's resolution for 2022. One of them, at least, that goes past the 1st of January, is around to make 2022 the year of the happy horse and the start of that. How can you do that? Well, I hope tonight's webinar is giving you some really practical tips on how you can assess whether your horse is happy and how we can make them happier still. I just want to say thank you again for joining us tonight and for being so good on the questions, and a real thank you to Nat, to Christa and to Lizzie for being such, as ever, brilliant panelists. The next webinar we have is on Wednesday, January the 26th. It's so exciting. We don't have, I can't tell you what the topic is in brackets. We haven't quite decided yet, but please do, we will put out promotion for that in the new year, but please mark your diaries, 7 p.m. UK time on Wednesday, the 26th of January. So to Nat, to Christa, to Lizzie, thank you once again. And as you can tell, this is December, so I wish you a happy, peaceful and healthy Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you all in 2022. Thank you so much.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you. Bye.